Hello and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders, the podcast show where I interview the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Ben Page. Ben is the Chief Executive for Ipsos Mori. He was one of the leaders on the first management buyout in 2000. He's a frequent writer, performance management expert, and speaks a huge amount when it comes to leadership trends globally. In addition, Ben has and does a number of additional pieces of extracurricular work around his non-exec portfolio and charitable services. In addition, he serves on advisory groups such as the King's College London and is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He also serves on advisory groups for the King's Fund and Social Market Foundation, or SMF, and is a trustee of the Centre of London and at the Centre of Ageing Better, in addition to patron for Create Streets.
That will do. I think that's enough.
Okay, let me get one last piece in then. Right. Ben was named as one of GQ's 100 Most Connected Men of 2015, which I really want to ask you about later. And I knew that actually from one of our mutual friends who tells me that story, and often bigs you up as well. Anyway, you know who that is. So welcome, Ben, to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Welcome. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's strange times. We have everybody sitting locked in their bedrooms or offices, communicating on little screens like this. But anyway, it's good to see you.
I know, it's very good to see you as well. I'm just sorry it's not in person. I'm glad that we did get our breakfast meeting in, though.
The last breakfast in London.
I know it was indeed. And, I think, of course, usually, I ask individuals who are on the show to kind of, give us a brief kind of nutshell story of how they came to be where they are today. But I think, as you've mentioned there, these are incredibly uncertain times. And so first and foremost, it would be great to, I guess, see how you're feeling given COVID-19 and see how, you and the team are getting through this.
Well, I think it is tough. Like a lot of industries, we've got huge disruption. I mean, this is, to me, this is like 2008, but at high speed. So it's all, our business in 2008-9 fell by about 20%. In fact, it took 1 or 2 years to really become clear what the impact was of the recession on our business. But this, with things like face-to-face contact, which still is hugely important for us, stopping virtually overnight, we've got thousands of people who rely on us, who collect data for us, and are paid weekly, and we're now having to obviously switch them on to furlough them under the government scheme. You've got clients who rely on the data coming through, and again, that's having to be transferred and switched at breakneck speed. You've got clients going bankrupt. You've got clients closing programs. Obviously, if you work for airlines, which we do, they're not working anymore. If you work for hotel groups, which we do, they're also experiencing tough times, and automobile manufacturers. So I think it's the speed of the shock in a sense. So just spending a lot of time on the phone and on screens. Actually, I mean, it's a weird setup where. Finally, we've had this pandemic, of course, when things like Zoom, which we're talking on now, or Microsoft Teams, Skype, etc., they'd finally just about reached a point where you could run things, online. And so I spend most of my days just on calls with groups of people, trying to tell a story about what we're doing. We've had to up the amount of communications we're doing internally massively. I do a webinar now once a week where I talk to the staff like this. For about half an hour or so, and we prepare for that quite carefully in terms of the messages, so everybody hears the same thing. I normally used to do that every month. Now I'm doing it every week, and I think on a whole load of things, all of those things have it's up the ante. People want to see their leaders at times of uncertainty. So and I've no idea whether this means my business is shrinking by 10% this year, 20% this year, and what that means for employment for colleagues. I mean, it's just a really fast moving thing. But finally, I think the main thing is, people will remember how they were treated at times like this. And one of the things I've got at the moment is people who resigned to go off to other jobs which no longer exist, and they were, telling us they were on their way, and now they're saying, please, can we come back? Or people who have left their employer, but of course I'm trying to hold down wage costs now and payroll. What can we do? And so trying to do the right thing for those sorts of people is also, on our minds as well. So it's a very fast moving scene, and I'm sure this is the same for lots of leaders of organizations of all shapes and sizes. It's going to take a month or two just to really understand at least even the short-term impacts, let alone before we move on to the long-term impacts, which may be, do I need an office with thousands of people in it? We may decide we don't anymore. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and you're quite right. It's it's very, very difficult to almost predict exactly what's going to happen, because things are literally changing, not even just by the day, but also kind of hour to hour. Fantastic though that you kind of are communicating a lot more, upping the ante, as you've said. And I really do think that these are times where we will see those businesses who do genuinely really care. I've been fortunate to speak to a number of other CEOs this week, and those that are really kind of stepping up to the mark are over communicating. I think really you can't communicate too much, especially as you quite rightly said, these are the times where employees really want to feel that reassurance and want to feel that they are being looked after. And at times like this, we look to our leaders, we look to our chief executives, just to kind of give us that whether it's a pat on the shoulder or whatever, and tell us that everything is going to be okay. And of course, for some people, it's worse than others. I'm seeing, unfortunately, a lot of redundancies, which is terribly, terribly sad. Those that, of course, like yourself, are trying to do the right thing, trying to keep people in their employment or guarantee jobs and such like. But it is, it's a critical time, really.
Yeah. No, and we'll see how it goes. I mean, the good thing, I think, one thing I would say is, having lived through significant recessions in the past, and in fact, I took this job, I became CEO in the aftermath of the 2008 recession. So you rapidly, having done this, I've done this now for about 11 years, and as a result, I think you've sort of seen it before. So not to hope things will get better, but you're also able to have a bit of I suppose, perspective. Whereas if you were coming to this fresh, it might be even more shocking in a way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I guess just on a slightly more kind of positive note, and any tips and tricks that you may have, Ben, because you have, like you said, you've lived through many times of turbulence and come out the other end, which is great to hear. But for those that are tuning in today, whether they be other chief execs, and we have a lot of leaders who tune into the show, or whether it be, that you're a young aspiring graduate thinking, oh my goodness, this is just kind of, remarkable times. What are kind of some of the things that you've learned in this short amount of time that might be able to help those in self-isolation?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is regular communication, and if you can use things like GoToWebinar, MS Teams, or Skype or Zoom to do that, then they can see you talking. Actually, turn on your cameras is a key thing, and make sure it's regular. Think carefully about the messaging, because people want to know that somebody has got a plan. The fact that you may not have a definitive plan, because things are very uncertain, in a sense, they don't want to know that. It's a bit like the government communications. Some of the stuff that they did on social distancing was unclear. Like, were you meant to stay and were you meant to go to work or not? And it's only when you really you have to keep things very clear. So think about what you're going to say when you're going to tell people about difficult decisions. There's no point in sort of making everybody suicidal too early. And so think about that. But regular communications, ideally, I think face-to-face, even if it's online face-to-face. The other thing is, I think WhatsApp groups are really useful for teams. So things like WhatsApp or similar apps, but where you can, and actually what's quite interesting, of course, it may bring people closer together. Some of the people who've lived through the Chinese experience say that actually they're communicating both with their colleagues and their families in some ways more, because you're suddenly seeing the whole domestic life of your colleagues that you never saw before. You're sharing jokes and things that usually if you were just using email, you wouldn't. And I think making sure that everybody in the company gets a check-in with somebody face-to-face, even if it's virtually, every day, is hugely important. So, we're asking people to have little prayer meetings or huddles every morning electronically with the cameras on, where we can just sort of see how everybody's feeling. we're all going to have low points during this period of basic incarceration in our homes. And so just acknowledging that, is part of that, is about accepting that it's going to happen. But thinking of all the things that you can do to get around that, having a routine, getting washed, getting dressed, sitting at your desk, pretending you're going to work. All of these sorts of things are a little sort of coping tricks, and not working too much. Actually, the risk is that you sort of get out of bed and everything's in crisis. You start work at 7 a.m. and don't go on till 11 p.m. at night. You'll go mad.
Some really good tips there, really good tips. And I think you're absolutely right about the face-to-face contact. And the great thing about Zoom, I know that you're calling in from your iPhone today, but I kind of almost do feel like I could be in the room with you, which is great. And I think, the power of facial expressions and everything like that, it does make you definitely feel kind of closer to people. And, I guess finally on the communicating and bringing us close together, I absolutely agree. We are all in the same boat together, aren't we? And we absolutely are. And I was chairing a couple of meetings yesterday with a global organisation, and it was fascinating hearing some of the things that they were coming up with. Actually, there was many people they didn't know in different departments across the globe, and having this opportunity now where there's never an excuse not to have enough time. People are starting to reach out and speak to people and forge relationships with those that they wouldn't perhaps have done otherwise.
Yeah, I think, and people are having to spend time on organising things like webinars, and it is an opportunity for businesses, once you're through the immediate crisis, to start thinking about how are you going to sort out your training or sharing content with people. There's a lot of people who, if you're a business that's a professional services firm like us, a lot of people spend a lot of time actually traveling to see clients, and of course they're not traveling anymore, so they actually have a lot more time to think about either learning about products, services, thinking, writing, etc., or of course just trying to have one-to-ones with clients electronically, although clients themselves are insecure, just like us, what's going to happen to their business, etc., etc. But no, so I think there will actually be benefits somewhere in all of this, and one is that we may actually know each other we'll certainly know each other in our businesses better at the end of the process than we perhaps did with just our data, emails and meetings face to face in an office environment.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. When you're in the trenches together and you share those challenges, I think it does make relationships much stronger. And ultimately, I'm a very big believer in the fact that talking does ultimately, hopefully it obviously leads to a solution, but I think just sharing those issues and being able to be open.
Yeah. Margaret Heffernan's new book, which she launched a few weeks ago, is called Uncharted, and it's about how you can prepare for the future, or indeed predict the future. But one of the things that she looked at in terms of crisis and shocks, which of course we're living through now, one of her observations is really interesting, which is obviously in a sense common sense, but it's just interesting to see it coming back in the research. And that is that companies where there are high levels of trust between teams and between management teams that have been working together for a long time tend to be more resilient and better able to deal with things like CV-19 and its implications, because they can just be more honest, open, and probably more efficient and effective in getting things done because they know each other. And so I think that's another, so if you haven't got those bonds, go and build them, because you're going to need them in the next few months, because I don't think this is going to be a short-term crisis. It has all sorts of longer-term implications.
Mm-hmm. I've written that down there. I've not actually read Margaret's new book, but it sounds excellent.
It's well worth reading. I mean, she even talks about death, which I always sound morbid when I say things like that, but I mean, she's really interesting. She's very widely read, and she's does a lot of in-depth research. I met her in the process of this in one of her other books, where she was looking at polling and how accurate it was, which is sort of interesting in its ability to predict the future.
Mm-hmm. And I think that she's very right, and you are also, because ultimately that kind of that emotional intelligence and bond building is something that cannot yet be emulated by artificial intelligence or kind of the digital world that we live in. And so, kind of businesses with the heart and individuals and leaders that have got that, high EQ, IQ, etc.
Yeah.
I genuinely think will be the most successful.
We hope so. I mean, I think, yeah, and it's going to be some time before AI does that. And if you think that you can just treat people like objects, you will find very rapidly that they'll do the same to you.
Mm, indeed, indeed. No, I can't imagine wanting to be treated like an object by anyone, certainly not work. Well, I guess moving on to kind of other things then without, kind of, digressing too much from,
Sure.
I guess, diversity and inclusion. I wonder, whether you might be able to just kind of share in a potted nutshell, because I know you've done lots and lots and lots of things, a little about
Yeah.
kind of how you came to be where you are today. One of the things I'm always very keen to explore when it comes to kind of leaders and especially chief execs is how they came to be where they are, and perhaps some of the whether they be difficulties
Sure.
had along the ride.
Plenty.
And
I wasted at least 5 years by being difficult. I didn't ever expect to be a chief executive. It wasn't ever my sort of goal or anything like that. I studied history at university. I really enjoyed it. I didn't particularly want to go into business. I didn't know what I wanted to do when I was 21, quite frankly, after graduating. And I ended up joining the graduate training scheme at Ipsos Mori because I needed a job. And I thought I'd been working as a telephone interviewer for about 6 months after graduating, just as something to pay the bills. So I thought, and at some point I thought I'd better join a graduate training scheme somewhere. So I joined the Mori, as it was then, graduate training scheme. And I hated it to start with, to be quite honest. It was very, very hierarchical. One of the jokes I always make is that I've stayed there for 30 years or so I could fire everybody who made me miserable back in the 1980s. And there's a tiny bit of truth in that, because I have changed the culture over the years. But I mean, I think the society has changed since the 1980s as well, quite frankly. And what was acceptable in business in 1987 is not acceptable in business in 2020 by any stretch of the imagination. So the world has changed too. Anyway, I stayed there. After a while, I did about 9 years actually, and I was sort of doing okay. I'd been made a director. I had my son. I got married and had a son. I bought a house, had a big mortgage. Still wasn't earning very much money, and I remember being a bit sort of frustrated. I applied to go and work somewhere else, and I got offered a job from somewhere else. But then, and I resigned actually. But they doubled my salary and said you must stay. So I did. We did a management buyout a couple of years later. We borrowed 33 million to buy out the founder. About 5 of us, although we got everybody to have a share in the company, which was, we can talk a bit about that. And then after 5 years later, we sold the business to Ipsos, so it became Ipsos Mori. We sold it for 88 million, so that was good. My ex-wife's very grateful. And then I was during this period, I was in charge of our government work, and that grew and grew under the expansion of government by Tony Blair in the 2000 to 2010 period. I became CEO of the whole thing in 2009. I think partly because of this very strong performance of the business that I'd been leading. It grew from about 40 people to 250 people. Although I wasn't desperate to be the chief executive, I was quite pleased not to have to report to anybody else, frankly. So I thought, if I'm, I'll do the chief exec job, even though it's not my obsession about being a chief exec. But anyway, I've now done it for about 11 years, and we've had, until the coronavirus hit us, at least, it's been we've doubled in size, and our performance has tended to outperform our peer group of major agencies. So it's been okay, but it was never my plan. And I've learned a lot of things on the way about leading people. Certainly my experience of male leaders, and possibly some female leaders as well, is that you really learn about dealing with people and using different styles in different settings, when to intervene, when not to intervene, when to micromanage, when not to micromanage. Generally, don't micromanage would be my advice, but other people see it differently. And you tend to learn those things in your 30s. I mean, there may be some brilliant people listening to this who learned it all in their 20s, in which case, God power to them, and that's brilliant. But it's certainly, I wasted quite a lot of time by being, I was quite difficult, I think. I was, obviously reasonably bright, but probably a bit chippy, a bit edgy, not listening too much when I was younger. And it's only when I've mellowed that I perhaps became more successful, shall we say.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. And I have to say, I am, well, 33, as you know, and I do think so far the 30s have been the times where I've learned certainly the most about business and the most about people. But just
Yeah.
kind of reverting back to something that you said there, when you used to be very difficult, actually, and also, perhaps experienced individuals within the organisation as it was at the time, although I know it's very, very different to what it was now. What talk to me about some of those hardships and how you dealt with, I
Oh
guess.
my God. Well, I mean, I don't know. We used to have to work all night. I mean, there were times where you would be so busy this was when I was younger. I mean, we should hope that, I think, virtually never happens now, but it was by no means unusual to stay all night and keep going the next day and not go to sleep or anything. I mean, and I remember leaving a note. I remember my boss, who now at the age of 86 works for me. But at the time, I remember leaving him a note at 9 p.m. saying, this is as much as I've been able to do. And the next morning, getting a call going, I don't know, young people, they have no respect for their elders. So the next night, I remember leaving it. The next night, I left something on his desk at 1 a.m. And I said, "Oh, Bob, where are you?" I left a note for him. "Bob, where the fuck are you?" Sorry to swear on your podcast.
No. Right.
But and it's sort of, maybe I was a bit hard on you. I think things like, very obvious things like learning to delegate. So I think it is learning that sort of sense of perspective. And I was also very, very driven when I was a sort of young manager of a division for the first time. And I think it's important to be, you need to be driven. You need to not accept mediocrity. But there are ways and means of doing that. And again, I've become better at that. I used to do things like sort of stride onto the floor, holding up an offending piece of, an offending presentation that somebody had done, and, saying, John, come in, stand up in front of everybody and explain how you completely messed this up. And I learned over time to learn to do this in my office rather than on the floor, or even to employ somebody really nice, who still works with us. I had a deputy, and his job was to be nice to people, because I was in a hurry at the time. So I think if you can combine if you're not going to be nice, at least be effective and efficient, and get somebody else to be nice to them. And I think it's this general thing, know yourself. So hopefully know your strengths and weaknesses. If you are difficult, then know that you're being difficult. Don't be difficult, and know why you're doing it. And ideally, remember that actually it's generally easier to get things out of people if you're not persecuting them the whole time. Mm-hmm. I learned that in the end.
Well, it certainly seems that you've got there, and you're a very well-rounded individual. I think, again, reverting back to one of the pieces that you said there, about men being, perhaps emotionally retarded. And I wouldn't necessarily agree, but I also do think, and I hope you don't mind me saying, when I first met you, you have got this, you're in touch with your feminine side, I think, at the same time. And, that
it's being brought up by a single mother, Leila, and that's what does it.
Really? And I didn't know. I would like to talk about that actually in just a second as well.
Yeah.
But I think that is important. I think there is almost this, how to put it? I think sometimes with guys, and especially male chief executives that I do meet, who might be of the, more seasoned generation, shall I say, that for them, behaving in a, I'm fine all the time kind of way, and quite a classical, male, almost, trying to be over brave, I suppose, and not wanting to show that there's any chinks at all in the armor. I don't think it's necessarily the way to get people to open up. And I mean, within 5 minutes of kind of, sitting down for breakfast with you, I think I probably told you my life story. And I think that is actually
I'm a researcher, remember?
Yeah, but it's a gift, though, isn't it? Because not everyone can do that. I mean, I like to think.
No, it's an interesting point you make there, Leila, because there's a very good. I don't spend a lot of time reading leadership books, but one of the ones that was recommended to me 10 years ago when I became CEO is a guy called Ronald Heifetz, and he wrote a book called Leadership Without Easy Answers. But one of the quotes from that, which I find important, is what is it? Great leaders selectively show their weaknesses. So you don't, if you've got it all hanging out and you're completely mad and it's all crazy, then that is not going to be reassuring. But being a bit human from time to time is effective. So that's really important. And also, again, what people expect of leaders in the 21st century is different from what they expected of leaders in the 20th century. And people want somebody, they don't want this sort of remote, autonomous, godlike figure. They want a human, you know, deference is almost dead. There's still a fair bit of it around, but they want somebody that they can at least vaguely relate to. So great leaders selectively show their weaknesses.
I think that's a great quote, and I think you know, for sure, people want someone that they feel they can relate to, and I think that if they can, you know, they want to work harder. You know, if I've had you know, although I haven't had, you know, a boss for much of my career, when I have had someone that I really buy into, I absolutely want to work harder for them. But let's talk about your upbringing. I didn't realise, I have to say, that you were brought up by a single mother, and I wonder, you know, is this one of the reasons that you are so, you know, tuned into your emotional intelligence?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I think I'm not sure on my you know, on my life isn't a, you know, I don't think I've mastered life at all by any stretch of the imagination.
You're not a classic CEO, though, I wouldn't say.
Oh right, no, okay, maybe not. No, that's probably true. No, my father's an academic. He's still alive. My mum's dead now, but she was a sort of primary school teacher, and when I was about 7, she decided to leave him and run off with a blacksmith, which was an interesting experience at the age of 7, and to be taken away from the university town to live in the middle of nowhere with the blacksmith in a place where, you know, which was fairly primitive. You know, the only heating was a wood fire and this sort of thing. Yeah, that was interesting. And then obviously and then my mum split up with the blacksmith after about 4 or 5 years of massive rows and breaking things around the house. So I think it gives you, you know, different people react in different ways to that sort of situation. My brother's an artist, and it's informed his art. But I think it probably makes you fair. I think that sort of breakup when you're young probably makes you, in some ways, potentially emotionally self-contained, but also perhaps, you know, aware of just the things that people go through. But different people react to the same situation in very, very different ways. It's a bit like, you know, it's interesting in some of the studies around post-traumatic stress that some people can see something absolutely ghastly as part of their work in the emergency services, and they're sort of, you know, they're processing it forever. Other people sort of clam up about it and just sort of carry on. And so different people deal with things in different ways. But that was, you know, I haven't really thought about that particular aspect of my, I suppose, my upbringing as making a particular difference to what we do. In fact, I would tend to, in my own version of myself, I would have thought that doing the history degree is as important, because there you're trying to process a lot of information and tell stories effectively from all of this information about what's happening, and you have to do it in a fairly rapid way and sort of tell a convincing story. And I've found that, and also work that I've done myself studying leadership as part of our practice, where we're looking at what correlates with strong organizational performance across the public sector and in the private sector. That was interesting. I learned a lot from interviewing other chief executives, actually, about, you know, what they did, and at 100 miles an hour, what do you learn? You learn that actually all the plans and process and micromanagement matters much less, at least in terms of what I've found out in my research on this, and much more around telling a clear story, clear goals, all of that stuff, being there for people, you know, articulating it, etc., random acts of kindness, those things. And interestingly, and what's particularly, I found particularly instructive in my own research on this as part of my work at Ipsos Mori, actually, was that nearly every leader tends to describe these things in the same way. But what's interesting is when you actually look at people's diaries, which I did as part of this work, unbeknownst to them, without their, I got permission to look at all aspects of their lives when I did this. I found that when I looked at their diaries, some of them actually did it, and others were just talking about it. The ones that were actually doing it, of course, were the ones that were most effective.
That is absolutely fascinating.
Because, I mean, it is interesting. So it's, you know, you'd have thought that it was all about having clear plans, accountabilities, you know, managing the process, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, you have to have all those things. But the ones that do best, at least in the research that I've done, are the ones that get that, you know, they can't micromanage the work of thousands of people. What they can do is develop a culture that defaults to doing the right thing and defaults to doing the right thing for the business. And if you can do that, then in one sense your work is done. I mean, my constant fantasy about Ipsos Mori is that I can, just pop in once a month to look at the spreadsheets and it's all going well and I can go away again. I mean, of course, it doesn't quite work like that, especially now with the coronavirus. But it is about building a culture where you don't have to intervene all the time, because people know exactly what the right thing to do is. And there are so many good examples of that around the world.
I would love to see that report. I'd absolutely love to see that report. And
no problem.
Again, I really concur, and it's it's so pleasing to hear things like this, that ultimately being inclusive and being nice does rule over everything else.
Well, you can't be, I mean, there's no point in being, if somebody's completely useless, I mean, frankly, and they're never going to be able to do the job. I mean, hopefully you didn't hire them in the first place, but if you have subsequently discovered that and you've made all your efforts, then obviously you have to get rid of them in the nicest possible way, because we're not a sort of a job creation scheme, and we're a private sector business, but it can be done. You can do everything in a good way or a bad way. And again, we're going to see that as we go into potentially for many businesses a period of downsizing and low growth or of shrinkage. But yeah, I mean, and I think business you can run a business in a good way or a bad way. I just hope more businesses focus on really thinking about some of the soft stuff. There's a great quote from Tom Peters, the management consultant. What does he say? He says the soft stuff is the hard stuff. And that is something that people sometimes forget. It's the same on things like equalities. Business is in business ultimately to make money. It's capitalism, but it can do it in a way that goes with the grain of society, and it can try and do some good along the way. And in fact, most people agree with that.
Mm-hmm. I'm so pleased that you said that, and again, and I'm agreeing with a lot of things that you say here, but genuinely,
we'll find something for you to disagree with.
Okay. Well, jolly good. That'll make things more interesting. Right, no, okay. But I think in the world that we live in, millennials, etc. We want to be working for organisations that are actually making a difference, and I don't think the two need to be completely separate and devoid of one another. Business can be done, and make great money at the same time, but also, do great things for wider society.
Yeah, and I think actually one of the things, if you're a doubter and you're listening to this, or you're probably not if you're listening to this podcast, but one of the things that we've seen is that the more employees understand about the sort of CSR or ESG mission of the company and the things that it's trying to do beyond just making money, actually the higher their level of motivation. And that's one of the things, interestingly, that certainly in our company, when we look at our staff survey data, and of course that's what we do at Ipsos Mori, is that the people who feel that the company is trying to make a difference beyond just making money by doing surveys and research are actually more motivated. So telling people about making time for all of these things, I've found that the more flexibility I've given to staff and the more time I've given them to raise money for charity and the more time we've invested in things like that, actually the better we performed.
Mm-hmm. That's really great to hear. And I guess, just before we end up running out of time, I'd love to kind of go into almost a lightning round, which if you listen to the podcast before, I'm just going to ask you another couple of questions and kind of give you
go on then.
Seconds to answer them.
Okay.
But I would like to spend just a little bit of time just on, actually the first question I was going to ask you was, what has been your secret to success? But to take that a little bit further and also to give you longer than 30 seconds on this one, what other observations have you seen? Because you've said a number of pieces here which come up very frequently when I'm interviewing chief execs, such as resilience, such as, drive and everything like that. How also, from your experience, have you managed to maintain those specific areas?
Well, I think in terms of focus, you need to have a clear story, and you need to, people need to understand how it works. You need to be able to explain things almost in baby steps for people. But people want to know. They want to know what the sunlit upland is. What is the big goal? People want to be part of something that's more than themselves. Mm-hmm. I think in terms of maintaining things over time, there are things you have to realise that you can obviously be torn in 100 different directions. So you have to focus on some things that are going to make a big difference. So making sure that you have those conversations, making sure you've got those regular communications. Those really matter, even when you're too busy to have them. If you don't do them because you're too busy running the business or something else, your colleagues won't think you're too busy. They'll think you don't care.
Mm-hmm.
And so these small things like saying thank you, random acts of kindness. I mean, again, I'm still nowhere near perfect, but I'm better than I used to be. All of those things really, really matter to people, and they have in a sense almost a disproportionate sense. And it's amazing how just saying the wrong thing on stage, being glib, or making jokes about things, you think you're just being lighthearted, but actually you can end up alienating people. That doesn't mean to say so don't, if you have to be authentic, but if you're being authentic means being rude and offending people, then don't do it, for God's sake. But on the other hand, if you're going to be like a computer, it's not going to work. I think getting some sensitivity to all of those things. And the other thing is finally, making time for yourself, which is something that I think again people lead. You cannot be at 100% the whole time, or you will fall over and you won't be there. So you have to take advantage of downtime from time to time. You have to schedule a night off from time to time. And and it's not about being lazy, but you have to be able to recharge, because otherwise when you need it, when the chips are down, you won't be able to deliver.
That's really good advice. And I think also very key for right now, given the coronavirus.
You've got to do your stuff in your office. I mean, I sat down here at 8:00 this morning. I have gone off for a run, but it's now 6 p.m. roughly. I will do some more stuff later, but you cannot just if you do that, sit staring at a screen on the phone all for 10 hours a day, you'll go mad. You can't focus, and you won't be getting the quality of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And I think, there's times in our career, and, I feel it sometimes where I think, oh my goodness, yeah, I can just keep going. But, you are right. There is time where you do kind of crash and burn, and you realize, hang on a minute, got to take stock, got to put the oxygen mask on and make sure I look after myself, or look after number one, as selfish as that might sound, because if you're not looking after yourself, then how can you possibly lead and manage a business and look after others as well as you could do?
Absolutely. I mean, there will be moments when, you have to be there however you're feeling. I mean, I remember after the 2016 referendum vote, because although you're talking to Britain's most accurate pollster from the December 2019 election, one moment of joy was having to stand up after the polls were humiliated in the referendum of 2016, because we were 2 or 3% out. Having to go back and stand up in front of the company, of course, which is an international company with hundreds of people from across the European Union, and say, I know we didn't think it would happen, but Britain is actually leaving. And I remember saying, and then and sensing how everybody was feeling, and saying that we would guarantee on that day. I said I would guarantee that nobody would be left behind. That everybody, we would either marry them, naturalize them, or get them a visa, and that we would still be together because our diversity gave us strength as a business. And I got more gratitude from that, I think, than pretty much anything else I'd done during my career. But having had 2 nights with no sleep, both getting the final poll ready and arguing about what it should show, how we should interpret the data, and then of course dealing with as the results came in on live TV and commenting on them. By the end of that process, and then going into the office the next morning with working out what we were going to do and what it was going to mean, that was a tough time. But you have to. I think that there are times when you have to be there.
Absolutely. And I guess after all was said and done, and you're kind of being open and transparent, about things, clearly was well received. So
we were lucky. I mean, actually, we thought it was going to be terrible, which shows how good. Predicting the future is very hard for anybody, including us.
So difficult, even when you have all of the data.
Well, we had lots of data, and we thought the referendum was going. Leaving the European Union for an international company would be bad for business. We actually had our best year ever, because, of course, the devaluation of the pound meant that, which was 15% immediately after the referendum result, meant that our business, we became more competitive for the 60% of people who pay us in dollars and euros. I'd never have thought that in the run up to the referendum. So there we are. I learned something then as well.
Always learning, always learning.
Absolutely.
And I guess just before we go into our summary,
Yeah.
then I'd love to just ask you a couple of quiquick questions, I guess, in the
Okay.
lightning round, and I'll give you about 30
Okay.
seconds to
Go on then.
to answer each one.
Go
on. Interestingly, you talked there about kind of being being glib or saying the wrong thing and being careful and everything like that. What has been kind of the biggest challenge or biggest kind of standout memory to you where you thought, oh my goodness?
I don't know. You'll say things. I mean, in fact, I'm trying to. I mean, I've done it so many times. I can't even begin to imagine. I mean, I've put my foot in my mouth so many times and upset people. I once managed to promote everybody, and I did it in such a way that they all came to complain after pay rises and promotions. That was quite impressive. But a colleague said on stage, basically we've got 90% staff satisfaction here. 92% of people are committed to our culture, and frankly, if you're in the 1 in 10 who aren't, you should just leave. And that was a really bad thing to say, actually, interestingly. So, I mean, it's the sort of thing I would say, I've probably said in the past. And it's meant light-heartedly, but of course it gets interpreted. Somebody who's feeling pissed off about something hears that and think, oh, right, well, they really don't care. I'm not happy. They obviously don't care about me. So you have to be, you have to really think. But I've done it. I've done things so many times, and I'm sure I will again, And I think it's one of the risks of authenticity is, of course, that if you're authentic and open, you will upset people. In fact, I did something the other day. I was talking about the coronavirus on the call, and I said the word bodies. And I said, because people are going to die. And of course, because we're tuned into mental health, I got an email back saying, my mental health was deeply affected by you mentioning the word bodies during your podcast, Ben, or your webinar to. But at the same time, I need you all to take it very, very seriously because, thousands of people are very likely to die in the United Kingdom, and I don't want it to be you. So there's always a balance. And I think, yes, that's the downside of authenticity and openness is that, you will inadvertently offend people sometimes, but you just have to try and keep it, be aware of it, I guess.
I guess in circumstances like that, how would if someone's listening in thinking, oh goodness, I accidentally said a blooper or something like that, how can we rectify things like this that happen in communication? Because it's natural, we are all only human, and things like this are going to happen, especially if it is something that's said in person and then it's Chinese whispers, or it ends up then getting converted into text, can come across a lot more harshly perhaps than it was intended. So corrective measures, best corrective measures, or something like that.
I mean, I think you have to, if you've built credibility with people over time and they know you and you've been consistent and things, we all have a stock of sorries, and so do businesses. And so obviously if you're having to say sorry all the time, something's gone horribly wrong. But everybody generally has a stock of sorries, and it's about choosing the time in which to deploy them. On this instance, actually, I didn't, because I got far more positive messages than I did negative ones. And so if my tone has upset somebody, it's been appreciated by other people. But it's always a balance.
Absolutely. And next question then, what does diversity and inclusion and belonging, in fact, mean to you personally?
Well, it's about, we're all human, aren't we, at the end of the day? And we need to, particularly in our industry, we need to represent the society that we're part of. And so if we're all white middle-class graduates trying to understand ethnically deprived inner city communities, there's going to be even though we're terribly clever and terribly empathetic and terribly sensitive, there is still going to be a real issue if you don't understand it. It's funny, we were looking at a global survey that we did, and we have loads of stuff in there on gender equality, and we've got loads of stuff in there on trans rights and LGBT rights and various other things. And I realized that we didn't have very much on race. And I suddenly thought, why didn't we do that? And of course, I realized we may be on the team that's designing the questionnaire. We're pretty much, and so we just didn't probably think about it, which is the classic. Absolutely classic. It was really, really interesting, and so it's a reminder, even though we tried as a business to get people from all across the business, because we are ethnically diverse overall, but of course it just wasn't, and maybe they didn't see it as the black and minority ethnic people who are involved in teams didn't say, oh yes, you should have something on the questionnaire about that. So I thought that was really interesting. It really struck home that was just fascinating, that we thought all about gay stuff and trans stuff, and we thought about all sorts of other things, left-wing views, right-wing views, but we had been blind hopefully not willfully blind, to that issue. It's just a reminder that unless you are fully diverse, you won't fully reflect humanity's experiences.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example there, and it's an easy thing to do, but I love the fact that you're being very open about it. But yeah, no, absolute reminder that if there isn't that person in the room, then it's highly unlikely to come up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we try and actually invite. It's a long story. This is an involved process where hundreds of people get asked their thoughts and get asked to comment and contribute. But it's still interesting, and a lot of them are black, for example. But for whatever reason, it doesn't come up as a. They don't say that So it's fascinating. Yeah, it's an example of that sort of thing, and I think. I think it's also tricky in professional services firms because, in theory, everybody thinks we're all graduates, we're all bright, and so these things shouldn't matter, should they? But of course, we're also human, and they do.
Indeed. And finally, I wonder if you were to give your younger self some advice, and you could talk to the difficult young Ben,
Oh God,
when he was I don't know, let's say kind of a lot younger, teens.
Sure, 20 years, 30 years younger. My advice would be to my younger self, and I have thought about this. My advice to my younger self would be around certainly learning to listen, also choosing what you're going to be great at and focusing on something. I think I spent a lot of my 20s, and I think a lot of people spend a lot of their 20s, to be honest, deciding what they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
If you can find something that you're going to be brilliant at, and also what makes you uniquely good at it, and perhaps compared to other people in that field, and you can identify that early. It took me, the better part of 10 years to do that, quite frankly. That's just so much the better. If my son's very lucky. He's decided he wants to be a great fashion designer. I don't know if he'll become one, but he's had that ambition now for the last 8 years, and he's now 24 and just finishing his MA at St Martin's. So, lucky him. I didn't know that I was going to do this job. And in a way, I've changed the company to reflect the things that I'm interested in, while also, of course, hitting our profit targets. But I think that if I was 22 again, rather than 52 or 55 or whatever I am now, I would be saying, choose that thing that you're going to focus on, find out what you're particularly good at, and stick to that. Rather than railing against how unfair the world is and how difficult everything is. Because once you have that, you'll find that people are much more adaptable and interested in you, and you'll get on much faster. But it took me years, and I think finally, hard work always tends to pay off. I mean, that's what happens when we interview chief exec of FTSE companies and we ask their advice. They say travel, they say work in all parts of the business, they say learn to listen, they say learn to get international experience. But above all, they say put in the extra mile, make the extra effort, not necessarily the extra hours, but the extra effort. And I think if you're able to find those things and focus, my career only really took off when I decided not just to be a good market researcher, but to be the best, absolutely the best person I could be at what I did. And it was only at that point that I was invited to be part of the management team for the buyout and everything else. But that's a big mental leap. And a lot of people have very sort of ambivalent attitudes to their jobs. They do their job, and they're often very good at it, and they're very good at it, but they haven't made that mental decision to be brilliant at it. And I think it's when you do that you really see results. And that's a tough message for some people. They don't want to have to absolutely commit to something, but ultimately you have to.
Very true. And I love the expression hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. And like you say, it's not necessarily putting in those extra hours, but the mental leap, as you say, where you actually want to be the best you possibly can be. What a great way.
No, I couldn't. That's so important. And knowing that, I think the other thing is that a lot of people in jobs that they aren't particularly happy with, whatever it is, and almost at whatever level, we always fail to remember how much agency we have as individuals, and how much our future, how much control that it feels like we don't have any control. We have to pay our bills, and we have, blah blah blah. But actually, we have far more choice and control, even in the world of the coronavirus and the post-coronavirus world, than perhaps we'd ever have imagined. And I think that's something that certainly too many of my directors, if they're listening, I hope they're not listening, they don't realise how much agency and control they have themselves.
That's a really lovely way to end the show today, and some real great food for thought, Ben. So thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure.
Thank you so
No
much.
problem. Nice to see you, and see you non-virtually in September or whenever the plague is over.
Yeah, most definitely.
Okay.
And
all right,
very, very quickly,
yeah,
do a summary actually, although there's been so much there that I'm going to be super quick about it. But I mean, some of the standout moments, I guess, from this podcast for me were, some of the great insights actually, and also learning about you personally. I think, the resilience that you've been through, and clearly, perhaps even the younger years did, play a part in kind of, pushing you forward in order to I guess, achieve what you really wanted to. But, especially some of the pieces there around kind of employees really understanding more about CSR and kind of the various kind of issues, and that increasing level of motivation. So anyone who's listening, I guess, within organizations, and interestingly, I heard that from another chief exec actually.
Oh, that's interesting.
Just yesterday. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I won't. Well, I'm sure they wouldn't. I won't mention the company just in case.
Yeah.
But, they do a piece where they allow their employees to do a certain amount of charity work, and they've got a whole bunch of different charities that they can choose from. And I know that you do similar pieces here, where making time for that, like you said, is important. So hearing that really does, from the research you've done, increase motivation, I think is just absolutely fantastic, and also some great advice there. And so, I hope that individuals, businesses, business leaders who are listening can kind of really take heed of that fact. Over communication, absolutely key at times like this. I loved it actually when you said kind of, deference hopefully is, well, maybe it's not quite completely kind of dead, but actually leaders who are ultimately leading with emotional intelligence and genuinely caring, but also being concerted and careful, I suppose, about the things that we say and how that might affect people, is again, something that I really do hope that all business leaders will be doing in the future. And I guess finally, I love that quote from Tom Peters, which I'll put all of this into the show notes at the end of the day. But the soft stuff is the hard stuff, and I think actually that emotional piece is often the most challenging to get right. And so, thank you so much for sharing that.
No problem. Talk to you again. Take care.
Talk to you very soon, Ben. We are going to be with you more regularly during these unprecedented times, so please do make sure that you tune in. You can visit us at www.dialglobal.org/podcast or www.leilamckenzie.com/podcast. All the notes will be up there from today's show, and you can download on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for watching the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. Please do feel free to hit the like button below, or if you'd like to receive future notifications, do ping the notification bell here at the side. If you're interested in the audio version only, you can find it on the following streaming platforms. Any extra info and descriptions will be in the links below. Look forward to seeing you soon.